So a few years ago, I was invited to a friend's campfire in our backyard. And it was an interesting gathering of people. I have to give you the context of who was involved in this little campfire. See, there was myself and my wife, and I'm a pastor, and my wife was with me. And there was a woman who was an atheist, and her boyfriend, fiance, she was Jewish and he was atheist. And there was a gay couple there, Dan and Todd, and my friend. And it was her birthday. And so we gathered together. It was quite a unique gathering, actually. You can imagine what that kind of gathering would have been like. It was kind of fun. We actually took a group photo together. And that was before selfies. And so we took a picture of the bunch of us, and it was just awesome. Well, I was sitting at the campfire. It was getting late into the evening, and Todd was sitting beside me. And he looked at me, and he said, "So, Ron, tell me the meaning of life." And he had a little too much to drink at this point, and I was like kind of stunned by the question, because it was a deep question to ask at this moment, especially this late in the evening. And so I start stalling. It's a tactic you use when you don't know the answer right in the spot, right? And he says, he called me out. He says, "You're stalling." And I'm like, "Yeah, I am." And so I actually turned to him and I said, "Okay, here's the meaning of life. It's to love God with your heart, soul, and mind." I was in for a really good conversation. He shrugged, said thanks, and moved on. I was like, all right. I was looking forward to a faith conversation. It didn't happen. He seemed to be happy with my answer, and he moved on. You know, Jesus was asked this question in a different way. Jesus was asked the question, what is the greatest commandment ever given? And we see this in Matthew chapter 22, verse 37. And Jesus answers, and he says, to love God with your heart, your soul, and your mind. Heart, soul, and mind. I get the fact that Jesus said to love God with your heart and soul. It's the warm, fuzzy part of us. We can get that feeling, that sense of emotional response to God. But Jesus adds in the dynamic of the mind, the intellect. You do a quick study of the Bible, and you begin to realize that over and over and over again, you see the importance of the mind. You can see Proverbs that teach, as a person thinks, so are they. You can jump into the New Testament, into one of the smaller writings, letters that are written called Philippians, and you can see a verse that says that we are to focus our attention, we're to fix our thoughts on what is right and true and just and holy. We can go to another writing in Romans chapter 12 where it tells us that we are to give our bodies as a living sacrifice to God, which is the only acceptable worship before God, and that we are to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. The Bible teaches a lot about the mind. We spend a lot of time there, don't we? Right now, you are thinking about the things that I am telling you or sharing with you. Before you got here today, you woke up and you're lying in bed and you thought, do I go to church or not? Glad you showed up. I had a dream last night we had standing room only, but we're almost there. I also had a dream that I got in a fight with Jerry this morning, which hasn't happened yet, so. But the mind, the space that we spend so much time. Lots is talked about, lots is said about it in the Bible. This morning we are talking about mental health, mental illness, mental wellness. And it's interesting as I think about even the phrase, mental health, mental wellness, mental illness, whatever the phrase may be, I find that it creates a lot of emotional response. Because it's a deep concern. So many people are experiencing and dealing with this topic. Schools, our public schools, teachers, administration are trying to figure out what to do with this topic. Workplaces are wrestling with what to do with this topic. Families are struggling deeply with this topic. Matter of fact, there's families within our own community, in our church, that are battling this topic every single day. And the reason why I wanted to do this topic today as a standalone topic is because I think and believe that the church is doing a lousy job of figuring it out. Now, there are some churches that are doing a phenomenal job at this and dealing with it in incredible ways. But I think there are times where we back away from it. I think about this. When in a community like this, when someone is ill, when someone gets cancer, we rally, which we should. We have a family right now that I know of in our community that's struggling with a loved one that has cancer. And the small group of people that are gathered around this family are responding. They're caring. They're providing meals. They're bringing money to help cover costs. They're giving cards. They're rallying, supporting. When there's an accident, we know what to do. We respond. It happened just a few months ago. Someone in our community had an accident. And the community that was around them responded to them. When it comes to this topic, we don't know what to do with it. We don't get casseroles together. We don't get cards together. We don't rally. We back away. Because we just don't know what to do with this. We don't know how to care. I'm going to get very honest and transparent with you. I don't even know what to do. I struggle with this. How to respond. I'm more inclined at times to pull away, to avoid, because I just don't know what to say. I don't know how to interact. See, I think this topic is the silent illness in the church. It's silent. Like the volume's on 0, right? Because we just don't know what to do. We don't know how to respond. Now, some well-intended followers of Jesus try. They'll say things like, just pray harder. It's like, really? Do you think they're not praying? You just have to have a little bit more faith and you'll be fine. Really? Do you think that the person doesn't have faith? Or the labels like, it'll pass. That closing image of our bumper just haunts me every time he looks up and we see the phrase, it'll pass. We just don't know how to handle this. We don't know what to do with it. And so we just be silent about it. So this morning, what I want to do is I want to click the volume up to 1. I don't want you to come in here thinking that I'm going to crank it to 10, because I'm not. Too much expectation when it's at 10. 1's good. Because I believe this morning, this is our first step as a church into the conversation. It's our first step of exploring what to do with it. And I don't even know where this is going after this morning. I don't. I just feel it was my role and responsibility to step in obedience to just have this morning and just prayerfully consider where we're headed and what we're going to do. Because I know that I need to get better at this. A few months ago, I did a talk on our thinking and what the Bible says about it. And afterwards, guy who's part of our community came up to me. He waited graciously and patiently for me, and because I was talking with some other people, and he pulled me aside and he graciously, very graciously said to me, Ron, he said, I got what you were saying, but what about people who deal with mental health and mental illness? It's not just changing the way you think. And I looked at him and I'm like, you are so right. And I missed it. So my role and responsibility is to find ways for us as a church to get better at this conversation. How I want to do this morning is I'm going to change it up a bit. And I'm going to invite a panel of people to come to the stage at this time. And there are 3 people from our church. You guys, that's your cue. That was the cue. You missed the baseball sign. Anyway. Because I believe that these 3 are going to help us with the conversation way better than I could ever do on my own. And so would you welcome Ray? I almost forgot your name. Ray, Mike, and Julie. Would you welcome these guys to the stage? All right. I have questions for you that I have to bring up on my phone. There we go. All right. So I already gave you the names, so I would just like you to go down the panel, quickly introduce yourself, give us your background, and why you're here. No, don't why you're here, but just your background.
He told us to be here.
Yeah, I told you to be here.
My name is Ray. I am a husband, a father, and I am currently a teacher with the Public School Board, where my role is the learning coordinator for special education with the portfolio of mental health and behavior. I'm also someone who is part of this church, and I serve on the drama team, which has just been a great piece for my life.
Good, awesome.
Cool. So my name is Mike. I'm also a husband and a father of 3 young boys. And you might have seen me actually up on stage here before. If you've been here before, I serve in the music team here. So this is a bit of a shift for me to actually be talking a little bit.
You're nervous without a guitar.
I am actually, yeah.
Can we get him a guitar so he feels more comfortable?
Yeah. But outside of my role here in the church, I'm also a social worker and therapist. And I've been working with people that struggle with mental health problems for about a decade now, both in a healthcare setting, and now actually I'm also working at the Thames Valley School Board as a social worker there.
Awesome. Julie, I know you're not a husband, but you go ahead.
I'm a wife and mother of 3, and I've also been part of Forest City for a long time. And I'm a trained psychotherapist. I've been home with my kids for the past 6 years, and I serve on the ushering team.
Awesome. Good to have you guys here. Thank you for doing this. We've prepared some questions. I've given them some questions, and we're all ready to go here. That's why they have their pieces of paper to stay focused just in case. That's why I use the papers as well. We're going to start with Mike. Why is this conversation so important for the church?
Yeah, so this is actually, I'm very excited to be able to have this conversation this morning. And I think as I was reflecting on this question, I think there's a few reasons why this is so important. And the first is just the very present reality of how prevalent mental health problems are within Canada and within our community too. So we, like as a church, and some of you, if you've seen our website or if you've heard Ron talking from the front, like we talk about Forest City North being a safe place for people to explore faith and learn about God and community. I think sometimes we say that so quickly without actually recognizing what that means. What does it mean to create a safe place to explore God? But I think if we're going to create a safe place, that means having this conversation about mental health and mental illness. So actually, I'm going to ask them to bring up a slide. I'm not sure that how aware as a community we are about how prevalent mental health concerns are. And I'm seeing that the font is pretty small. So maybe I'll read out some of the stats as well. So in case those of you at the back that can't read it, that way you know we're all on the same page. These are actually some stats that were taken by the website from the Canadian Mental Health Association. I'll just go through them quick. So mental illness indirectly affects all Canadians at some point in their lives, either personally through a family member, friend, or colleague. About 20% of Canadians will personally experience a mental illness in their lifetime. Mental illness doesn't discriminate. It affects all ages, cultures, religions, education, and income levels. And suicide is one of the leading causes of death in men and women from adolescence to middle age. Almost half of all people who feel like they've suffered from anxiety or depression never see a doctor about their concern. And only 1 in 5 children receive services to help them with their mental illness. So this is really significant and obviously really concerning. And I think the good news for us as a church community is that, like, as Christians, we believe that God has a lot to say about mental health and mental illness. And all the kind of intersecting factors of the biology and the medical aspect, the psychological aspect. We know that God has a hand in all of those things. So I think that the church is really strategically positioned to provide support and to engage in this conversation. But it starts by just realizing how significantly present it is. The other reason, though, I think is, so aside from the current reality, I think that we need to engage in this discussion because we haven't done well in the past with this conversation. Yeah. And I think in a lot of ways the church is making up for lost ground. It's not even neutral ground. I think we're making up for some lost ground.
I told you guys I might jump in and interrupt you. It's very fascinating because one of the things that's emerging right now is even amongst clergy, amongst pastors that are starting to now step forward and talk about their own personal journey of mental illness, and there's been some high-profile pastors over the last year or so that have been stepping forward and identifying this in their own lives. And there's a big-name guy in the States that, I mean, we're talking a massive community, and his mental illness, he was right on the brink of almost taking his life and was able to step forward and get some help. But yeah, it's such an important part.
Well, that actually kind of goes like really right into what I was kind of hoping to touch on a little bit is, I think as a church, it's sometimes we can see things or we understand God in acting in kind of black and white terms or based on our own understanding of Him.
Right.
But as a church, we've really struggled to understand how to address mental health or mental health problems or mental illness when those problems seem to continue despite the amount of prayer, despite kind of faith, and so we seem to kind of put limits on God and how God can act or be present in a person's life as they're going through a mental health struggle.
Sure.
And so I think we need to have inviting this conversation actually means kind of stepping away from those black and whites that, if a person continues to struggle or if we continue to struggle, that's not necessarily indicative of, a lack of faith or something like that. But that it can be so much more complex in a beautiful way than that. So I think, the other part is that personally as a therapist, I've witnessed the struggle of people who I feel would really benefit from being connected to a church community for support. That for whatever reason, because, and I talk broadly and include myself in this, but as a church, we haven't really engaged in a non-judgmental way on the issue.
Right.
And so that's limited people's willingness or feeling like they're able to connect and to get support. But even sometimes more damaging when people have been part of a community and they felt judged and felt hurt, that's actually pushed people away from community. And so I think we've done that disservice in the past by not engaging and supporting and just seeing things purely as a spiritual issue when it can be so much more than that. And we need to have this conversation so that the church can start to become a place where people can find support and hope and grace.
Good. Awesome. Ray, we've been throwing terms around, and mental health, mental illness. I even threw in mental wellness a few minutes ago, so I saw some of the brochures out here. Can you talk a little bit about the difference between mental health and mental illness? Because there is a difference.
Sure. I think it's important that, because we do tend to use those terms interchangeably, when we were talking about mental illness, we are talking about a diagnosed mental illness. We're talking about an illness, exactly that, right? So this is that an illness that affects the way people think, the way they feel, the way they behave, the way they interact with others. It's something that comes out of, and this isn't necessarily important, but to the conversation, but I think it's important in defining the terms. Comes out of something called the Diagnostic Statistics Manual.
Can you say that again?
The DSM-5 is
okay,
what we'll call that.
Okay.
But it needs to come...
I thought you stuttered.
I did. Yeah. It needs to come from a trained mental health professional, right? This is something that comes from a diagnosis that comes from a doctor. Okay. And it meets criteria from that manual. All that to say that Mike talked about a stat, right? He talked about that 20%, that 1 in 5 of us who either have, are, or will experience or be connected to mental illness at some point in our lives. And for me, this is why the conversation has to happen. On any given Sunday, I'm not sure how many people are in here today, but on any given Sunday, we have, about 200 people, I think, approximately in this
auditorium.
Today
is 3,000.
2,000?
Yeah, 2,000. We'll go
I'm a
2,000.
teacher, my math is not great, but...
Yeah.
That says to me that on any given Sunday, there are 40 of us in here who are experiencing or have or will experience mental illness, as we talk about from that diagnosed piece. The conversation has to happen. That's a lot of us sitting in this room. And so therefore, to me, that's what makes it important. But there's another stat I want to talk about in defining mental health. If I were, and I'm not going to, but if I were to ask everybody in this room who has mental health to raise their hand, every hand in this room should come up. That is a stat that's actually 5 out of 5 of us. It's 100%. We all have mental health. Mental health is the way that, again, the way that we interact, the way that we feel, the way that we problem solve, the way that we interact with the world around us and when challenges come up. So it's that idea, and I'm going to ask them to throw a slide up for me as well.
You're a teacher, you have to have some sort of slide.
Mike and I said we're both in education, we got to have a crutch.
Yeah.
Because
you'll notice in a minute Julie doesn't have a slide.
That's why.
Okay? Yeah.
She just gets up like that.
Yeah,
it's just incredible.
Yeah.
But what I want you to think of is in terms of that this is a continuum, and we need to think of it in terms of just like our health. We all have seasons in our life where we have struggles, where we face challenges with our, as you said, our mental wellness, our mental well-being. So if you look at that slide, and I won't be able to reverse the corners for myself here, but what it tells you is this idea that there's this spectrum. We can have, I could be someone with a diagnosed mental illness, but have relatively good mental health and be rolling along with that in that continuum. Likewise, I can be someone who doesn't have a diagnosed mental illness, but have really poor mental health that is impacting my life. So I think these conversations, I think the separation of those two words is really important as we talk about this. We all have these seasons in our life where our mental health is impacted.
Sure, yeah.
And I like to think in terms of risk factors and protective factors. So when you think in terms of those risk factors, those are those things like a death maybe, or a stress at work, a loss of someone in our lives, exclusion from a community, those things that impact our mental health. Right? Those are those risk pieces, and they affect us whether we have a mental illness or not. We also have protective factors. Those are those things that we try to put in place to prevent or lessen those risk factors, to keep ourselves in that part of the continuum that where our mental health is at its optimum. So for many of us, that might be eating right or exercise, or for myself, part of that protective factor is coming to church on a Sunday morning. It allows me to be part of a community, part of a group of like-minded people who are able to have conversations like this.
Right.
But really important, I think, to keep those two things in mind. So for me, that is the piece. I like people to have an understanding of those two terms, but also that statistic of that 1 in 5 and that 5 in 5, so that we know this isn't a conversation for a few of us.
Right. It's for everybody. All of us. Yeah. Thanks. Julie, it's good to have you here, and you're going to share more of a personal bent on this. So why don't you just share from your own heart on why you're excited we're having this conversation, and also just some of your own personal story.
Sure. Thank you. I'm very excited we're having this conversation because I think a lot of us may be struggling in silence. And for me, myself, I'd like to say that anxiety and depression doesn't affect my life, but it does. And I definitely haven't mastered it. I remember looking back as a young girl, my dad telling me to stop worrying, to smile more, things like that. I think in my teen years, I started to struggle with feeling down, but I think it was more chalked up to just being a hormonal teenager of a single mom. It wasn't until my university years where I went to see a counselor that it was identified to me for the first time that maybe I might have some anxiety and depression. And in my first year of marriage, my dad passed away, and that's when my depression hit really hard for me. I was a counseling student, and one of the internships that I went to was with Dr. Grant Mullen, and he is a Christian doctor, and he taught me a lot about being a Christian with a mental illness, and it does exist, and it's out there, and he specializes in diagnosing people and determining whether they might need medication or not. That started my journey of trying medication. And that actually really helped me to focus enough so that I could learn some of the skills that I was learning in counseling, and helped my thoughts kind of slow down, because sometimes your thoughts almost feel like you can't shut them off, even when you want to. For example, when you're trying to go to sleep, or even anytime. Yeah. It's just kind of like this ongoing cycle of thoughts. So that really did help me. I'd love to say that it totally fixed me and that everything's honky-dory, and I have a lot of good days where I feel in charge of my feelings, but I also have bad days where I struggle to get out of bed or do basic things like empty the dishwasher. And on those days, it's hard not to feel shame for my lack of motivation.
Wow, yeah.
and for my lack of productivity. But I'm learning to be more compassionate with myself, and I'm learning self-care. I know I'm not alone in my struggles, and there are so many that struggle, and that's why I'm really excited that we're having this conversation today.
That's great. You know, it's interesting because on any given Sunday morning, I see you here roaming around, smiling, serving, and you come in with your kids and your husband. And the truth is that apart from knowing you personally, I would never have guessed that you are struggling with these things, and that you actually had to get medication, and that you're trying to find those self-care things. And I think it's so powerful that you're willing to be transparent and vulnerable today. And on the stage in front of all these people and sharing that. So thank you for that. That's great. And the fact that you said hunky-dory. I think that's just awesome. Thank you, Julian. Ray, I want to jump back to you because I don't want to talk to Mike. Ray, you're loved, Mike. Ray, what are some of the misconceptions?
Yeah, so I mean, there are a lot of misconceptions, and Julie's even kind of alluded to some of what I'll talk about. Let's talk about a few. One is that misconception that is not an illness, and you said it in your opening. That idea of, we sometimes tend to see people with mental illness who are struggling as making excuses for behavior, or we'd like to say, pull your socks up, get over it.
Right.
We would never say that to someone with a broken arm.
No way.
We would never say, "Hey, just get over it."
We'd hug, we'd embrace,
we're watching the arm. But we would never deny them a cast or a sling, or even help with some of those everyday tasks while they go through this struggle. And it's the same with mental illness. We need to have that support. We need to help people in those seasons. It doesn't affect me is another misconception. Hopefully by now we've kind of pounded on these stats. This does affect you, whether you believe it or not at this moment. If there's still a few of you in the room who are saying, it's still not my conversation. I can tell you that the stats are real, right? At some point in your life, you will be impacted by mental health. Maybe not yourself directly by a mental illness, but someone around you. And if I was a wagering person, and I'm not because I typically lose, but if I was
You're
wagering,
Dutch too.
I'm
You're
Dutch,
Dutch,
that's right. If I was a wagering person, I would on this one, and I would say that if you were in this room and you feel like, there's no connection for this conversation, I'd even be willing to bet many of you already have someone in your life who is struggling with a mental illness, and you're just not aware, whether it's by the stigma or whether it's by those protective factors we talked about that those people are putting in place. You used the example of Julie. Someone in your life who, until you had a conversation with her, no idea, right? So I think it's important that we're aware of that. Misconceptions like people with mental illness are violent or dangerous. And statistically, and research tells us that in and of itself, that correlation is not true. In fact, no more than the rest of the population. It's when we add in other factors like exclusion from a community or isolation,
right?
And that happens a lot to people with mental illness. That's when we see some of that information change. But people with mental illness statistically are actually more apt to be victims of violence than they are to be violent themselves. And then finally, I think this idea that there's no recovery from mental illness, or that people can't hold down a job or have family responsibilities. And Julie's a testament to the fact that that's just not true. That is a misconception. And Michael, I think, will touch a bit on the fact that we know there are lots of ways where recovery is possible. That doesn't change that there are going to be seasons and that there are people who struggle, and that mental illness comes in many different forms. But I think having that misconception in our minds kind of gets us in that standing back piece.
I can remember years ago thinking that someone who suffers with mental illness, is that stereotypical, in the hospital in a gown. And I've visited people who have been in the hospital, but that has carried over, and it's this misconception of, well, this is just what it should be, but reality is not. It's not. Yeah, that's good. That's great. Thanks, Mike. How can we change the narrative on this? What can we do as a church to change that?
So I'll answer that in 30 seconds. These are huge questions, right? Yeah. And I think I'm thankful to have had a bit of time to kind of wrap my head around that, because I think I've got some good ideas, but I'm sure I'll be talking with a few people afterwards and be like, I should have said that. Or this.
Yeah.
So there's a lot that as a church community we can do. But I've kind of grouped my thoughts into a couple categories.
Okay.
So the first is, I think shifting our understanding of the problem shifts our solution to the problem. And I think, in the past, if we see the root of the problem, or we understand the problem purely in spiritual terms, then sure, that makes sense that we would see the solution as purely a spiritual solution. But the reality is that with mental illness and mental health problems, we just know that that's not the case. The beautiful thing about faith in God is that as believers, we know that God can absolutely impact our biological being, our physical being, our spiritual being, and our psychological being and our ways of thinking. But we also know that there's a lot of other things, or God can work in other ways that we don't expect in those areas too. Mm-hmm. So, we in the counseling field and in the mental health field, we talk about the interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors that really contribute to mental illness. And the reality is that the evidence base for treatment for mental health problems incorporates treatment from all of those things. When we talk about, or we've all heard that analogy now of when a person's physically sick, we would say, go see a doctor for their specialized opinion. In mental health, or with mental health problems, really our response shouldn't be that different. Mm-hmm. And so it's important that as a church, we're aware of those other supports in the community that can help to kind of address things from those other perspectives as well. Mm-hmm. So that means encouraging and supporting people and seeking help from their doctor or from other community supports or therapists. And not feeling like we just have to deal with this alone as a church community. Right. And then also as people, so as we're guiding people along to accessing those supports, that we continue to walk alongside them as well. So it's not like, oh, okay, good, you're connected, right, there you go. This is a journey that we need to walk together. The one thing I kind of wanted to mention actually in this part was the interesting thing for me as a therapist, and as I've learned different kind of counseling approaches to working with people that struggle with these things, all of the different kind of psychological methods or psychological approaches for working with mental health problems personally, when I say psychological, I mean that's kind of the way that we think. Really, as a Christian and as a believer, the interesting thing for me is that as I'm learning these different approaches, they really line up well with things that I'm reading in Scripture and things that I know to be true as a Christian as well. And so I just think that's very, very interesting. And I remember a couple years ago, as I was going through some training, a good friend of mine that was a Christian therapist said that good therapy is godly therapy. That's great. And all truth is God's truth. And I think that's very true. Yeah. So we don't need to necessarily expect that God can only work through our church community. We can guide people to the community resources that are appropriate, knowing that God can work through those supports and resources as well. Yeah. So the second thing that I wanted to say in this is I think if we're going to change the narrative, we have to recognize where we've gone wrong in the past. Yeah. So we talked about that before, but I think a simple way to kind of change that narrative is simply to suspend judgment. I think, and sometimes, aside from suspending judgment as well, sometimes I think we just don't know how to react, so we don't do anything, right? And so the important thing, I guess, and this actually goes back to something that Julie had mentioned, where she was learning to have kind of compassion for yourself, right? And I think as a church community, we need to learn how to have compassion for each other, and compassion certainly before judgment. In counseling, one of the strategies that we talk about is this concept called mindfulness. Those
don't get Mike going on about mindfulness. I'll just warn you. Right? Don't ask him afterwards.
I get really passionate.
He's passionate about mindfulness.
For sure.
Go for it.
So what mindfulness is it's really at its root, it's about bringing your attention to one thing in a specific or current moment, and bringing your attention there without judgment. So it's really just about noticing things without judgment. And I think as a community, we can really practice mindfully caring for one another. It's about like noticing each other and actually caring for each other without judgment. But when we see that somebody's missing or we see that somebody's struggling, simply noticing that and bringing our attention to that and our care to that.
That is so key, Mike, because I think sometimes we go silent, right? It's the silent illness again. And let's say someone on a serving team or in a home group, or we don't see them at church for 3 or 4 weeks, and we don't think, oh, maybe I should touch base and just see if they're doing okay. It may be that they're not doing okay, and the reaching out can make that difference of caring. If everything's going fine, they've just been busy, well then no harm, no foul, everything's great. But there is a dynamic of that where you mindfully notice, hey, I should reach out and care. Yeah. And the church should be the place for that.
Absolutely.
It needs to be the place for that. Yeah. Sorry to jump in on your mindfulness talk.
Asking the question, right?
What's that?
Ask the question.
Yeah.
If you're wrong, it's okay.
Yeah. Asking the question and being okay if you're wrong. Yeah. Absolutely.
I love it. You're getting as passionate about mindfulness as I am.
Yeah, I know. Whatever.
It spills over. This is good. So the other part, I guess, is mindfully caring for one another is something that we can do currently just in our community. But the other part is, I think as a church community we can be proactive, and mornings like this are a key part of that, like how we engage in the discussion and talk about it even from the front, and kind of bring the issue forward. But I think it even goes beyond that, right? And how we're training our leaders to care for each other, and how we're talking about these issues in our community outside of just Sunday morning is a really important next step. And I think in small groups, so acknowledging it in our programming, training, etc. I think would really help to be proactive, and then building relationships with our community providers that are working in this area is really important. That's why I'm so excited, and I hope you have the chance to talk to some of the people.
Are you going to be there after as well at the table?
Yeah,
you'll be there. Okay, great.
Yeah.
People have some questions about mindfulness. Anyway, that's great. That's awesome. Thanks for that. Change that.
Be prepared
narrative.
To stick around for a while.
Yeah, that narrative. All right, good stuff. Last question for Julie. We're almost out of time, so if you can, you quickly, do your thing.
What's my question?
Oh, your question. Speaking of mental health, I forgot. Your question is...
I know what the question is.
Do you? Someone sitting here, if the statistics are true...
That's right.
We've got over 40 people sitting here that are struggling with a mental illness. And if the statistics are true, all of us are having mental health concerns at times, seasons. What do you say to someone who's sitting here?
Well, it sounds really cliche, but I would say you can't do it alone. You need other people in your life, friends, family, someone you trust, even a professional, to get the perspective. Sometimes when you're going through a hard time, you need others' perspective. I would say it's okay if you need medication, that's not a bad thing, and it's okay to be a Christian on medication. Also, for people that are trying to support someone with a mood disorder or mental illness, I would say ask them what they need. Don't try and assume that you know. I think for me, that was the support that meant the most when people said, well, what do you need? Do you need time alone? Do you need me to come over? And for the person to be able to say yes or no in that situation. And also, in Dr. Grant Mullen's book, his first edition of a book that really meant a lot to me, the title was, Why Do I Feel So Down When My Faith Should Lift Me Up? And that title really spoke to me because oftentimes you can feel far from God when you're struggling with your moods. And the last thing you feel like doing is praying. And that's okay. And I just don't want people to feel condemned for that. To know that God is still there, still caring for you, but it's okay if you don't feel it.
Awesome. Yeah. It's the three of you. I just want to say thank you so much. You've brought so much forward for us. We've covered a lot of ground, and I just want to say thank you for pouring your time into this and for what you do. The two of you in particular in your workplace, Julie, for you just opening up in front of us. Thank you so much for that. Would you thank these guys for doing this too? I'll see you guys. Okay, we're almost done, and we have a closing song for you. There's a piece of me this morning that wants to speak into you who are sitting here that are struggling with this. There's a darkness in your mind and in your heart and your soul. And I want to say this to you. Julie referenced a word, she said shame. And I don't want your shame to isolate you from God's love. I don't want the shame to isolate you from community. There's a verse in Romans chapter 8 that speaks to this reality. It says, "Can anything ever separate us from Christ's love? Does it mean he no longer loves us if we have trouble or calamity, or are persecuted or hungry or destitute or in danger or threatened with death? No, despite all these things, overwhelming victory is ours through Christ who loved us." If you're sitting here and you're feeling shame and you say, it's isolating me from God's love, I want to say it's not. It's quite the opposite. That His love is available to you today. And the other thing I want to say to you is don't allow this sense of shame to isolate you from this community. Listen, it's one thing for us to stand on this stage and talk about it. It's another thing for us to figure it out, because it's going to get messy. It's going to get messy. There will be times when we struggle with how to interact with someone on a team that you serve with, passing out a program or passing a coffee or setting up before everyone arrives early in the morning, and we find a way. And so I say to you, don't isolate yourself. Get involved, connect, so that we can find a better way to enter into this conversation. If you remain in isolation, this community will not be able to figure it out. We need you. We need you to step up. We need you to step forward and begin being part of the conversation. God is doing something beautiful. Beautiful. Whether you believe it, think it, know it, understand it, He is doing something beautiful. Scriptures teach us that we are a masterpiece of God. And I don't know about you, but that changes a bit of my perspective on the darkness that I sense sometimes in my own journey, my own mental health battles that I face, and that God is doing this beautiful thing in us and through us. I want you to listen to this song, and when it's finished, I'll come and have a few closing comments. Listen to this.